A millionaire pays a homeless woman to have a child, but when the child was born, he was shocked by boo-boo. Before watching the video, please leave a like and subscribe to support the channel. No one ever imagines that a life of riches could still feel so hollow. Yet that's exactly what sat at the heart of Vincent Hale, a man whose name echoed in boardrooms and financial headlines, but not once in a lullaby or whispered bedtime story. At 45, Vincent had everything, at least everything that the world measured success by. A towering penthouse with glass walls that kissed the clouds, sleek sports cars polished to perfection, designer suits stitched tighter than the masks he wore every day. He had power, influence, and more money than he could ever spend in 2 lifetimes. But the truth, the cold, heavy truth, was that when he stepped into that penthouse at the end of the day, silence greeted him louder than applause ever had. 2 marriages. Both failed. Both left scars too deep for stitches and too quiet for anyone to see. The first one crumbled under the weight of ambition. His. The second, well, that one died slowly, like a candle smothered by the absence of warmth. Vincent had loved once, maybe even twice, but time and betrayal taught him that love was nothing more than a transaction with terrible returns. Love, he decided, was a liability. It came with risks, emotions, chaos, and Vincent Hale didn't do chaos. Not anymore. But there was one desire he couldn't shake, one thought that whispered in the stillness of his vast, empty home, a child. Not for love, not for sentiment, but for legacy, for continuity, an heir to carry the Hale name forward when Vincent's chapter came to an end. Not a trophy child paraded in tabloids, not a weekend visitation with a co-parent who loathed him. No, Vincent wanted a child on his terms. Someone who bore his blood, his intellect, and would one day inherit the empire he had built with relentless precision. But how? The traditional path, marriage, family, love, he had tried and failed. It was too messy, too unpredictable. What Vincent needed now was control. Clean, clear boundaries. No emotional attachments. No courtroom battles or tearful regrets. Just an agreement, a contract. One life created in exchange for another being saved from ruin. He didn't need love to build a family. He needed a womb, a body willing to bear his child in return for financial security. It was a dark thought, perhaps even heartless by some standards. But Vincent wasn't trying to be liked. He was trying to secure a future, his future. And if someone out there needed saving, truly needed a way out of their misery, then maybe, just maybe, this strange clinical transaction could be a blessing to them both. That night, as rain painted sorrowful trails down the window panes of his corner office, Vincent sat alone, sipping bourbon that burned like all the choices he'd made. The city buzzed below him, alive with color and chaos, a reminder of everything he no longer let himself feel. He turned his chair away from the view, the ache in his chest barely acknowledged. He opened his laptop and began drafting a legal agreement, one that would change not just his life, but someone else's forever. He wasn't looking for a surrogate through some glossy clinic filled with smiling donors and hopeful couples. No, that wasn't him. He wanted someone real, someone who understood hardship, who wouldn't try to twist this into something it wasn't, someone who would see this for what it truly was, an opportunity, not a fairy tale. Because Vincent Hale had learned something brutal and honest about the world. It doesn't give you what you want, it gives you what you negotiate. And this would be the most important negotiation of his life. The next morning, as the golden light of dawn spilled across the silent city, Vincent Hale drove aimlessly through streets still dusted in yesterday's loneliness. His world was usually one of structure and strategy, but today, for the first time in a long while, he didn't have a plan. The streets hummed with life, yet Vincent's heart thudded in a slow, disconnected rhythm. There was no joy in the luxury sports car he sat in, no thrill in the purring engine or the envious glances from passers-by. What good was wealth, he wondered, when it only echoed louder in your emptiness? He slowed at a red light near downtown, just another pause in a life full of forward motion, and that's when he saw her. She was sitting on the cold pavement near the corner of 8th and Linden, half hidden behind a rusted trash can, her frame small, almost swallowed by the oversized army jacket draped over her shoulders. Her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the chill that clung to her like sorrow. Yet despite the grime and fatigue that veiled her face, There was a strange kind of peace in her expression. She was drawing, yes, drawing, on a crumpled scrap of paper with a half-broken pencil. Amidst the chaos of the city, she looked like she was somewhere else entirely. That stopped Vincent in his tracks. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the contrast, the fragility of beauty against the harshness of circumstance, or maybe it was something deeper, something unexplainable, something human. He stared for a moment longer, a frown forming on his brow. Who draws on a sidewalk like nothing else exists, he thought, almost irritated by the curiosity she sparked in him. The light turned green. He drove on, but 3 blocks later, he pulled into an empty parking lot and just sat there, engine humming, hands gripping the wheel, heart heavier than he cared to admit. Logic told him to move on. He had better things to do. He was a man of numbers and contracts, not of feelings. But something gnawed at him from the inside out. Something that whispered, "Go back." He shook his head, muttered to himself, "This is ridiculous." And yet, turned the car around. There she was, still there, still drawing. Vincent pulled up to the curb, rolled down his tinted window, and called out, his voice sharp, curt, more command than greeting. "Hey, you!" The young woman looked up, startled. Her eyes, blue, wide, cautious, met his. They were the eyes of someone who had slept too long on concrete and trusted too little. "Come here," he said, the impatience in his tone undeniable. "Now." She didn't move. Not right away. She studied him, her face etched with wariness, like a stray cat wondering if the hand reaching toward it held food or a trap. "I'm not asking," Vincent snapped. "Get in. I don't have all day." And somehow that did it. Perhaps it was the chill in the wind, or maybe it was the exhaustion of trying to survive the one more day on the streets. She stood up slowly, warily, brushing off her tattered jeans before approaching his car. Up close, she looked even more fragile. Her cheeks were hollow, lips cracked, and the sadness she carried seemed too large for her slight frame. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Vincent didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her, and for a flicker of a second, he saw not a vagrant or a lost soul, but someone who had once been cherished, who had once laughed freely before the world took everything away. "Get in," he said. "We need to talk, somewhere warm." She laughed bitterly. "I'm not a prostitute, if that's what you're thinking." His jaw tightened. "Don't insult us both. If I wanted that, I wouldn't have stopped here." The air between them was sharp, tense, but eventually, and without another word, she opened the passenger door and slid in. They drove in silence for a while. The only sound was the soft hum of the heater and the distant rattle of traffic. Vincent didn't look at her, and she didn't look at him. But something unspoken hung in the space between them, an understanding born not of words, but of brokenness. They stopped at a quiet cafe outside the city, a place Vincent knew well, one that offered privacy and warmth. Inside, they took a booth in the corner. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, defensive. He ordered 2 coffees and sat back, his eyes never leaving her. "What's your name?" he asked. She narrowed her eyes. "Does it matter?" "It does to me." She hesitated, then said, "Ember. Ember Lee." Vincent nodded, repeating it silently in his mind like a secret. Ember. A fitting name for a woman who looked like the last spark in a fire gone cold. "So, Ember," he said carefully, "I'm going to make you an offer, something that could change your life." She snorted. "You sound like every man who's tried to use me for something." "I don't want to use you," he replied flatly. "I want to make a deal, one that ends with your never having to sleep on the street again." He let the silence hang before continuing. "I want a child, my child. I want you to carry it. In return, you'll get shelter, full medical care, and a sum of money large enough to rebuild your life. When the child is born, you walk away with no obligations. I won't chase you. You won't chase me. Everything handled cleanly, legally." Ember stared at him, unmoving. "That's insane," she said finally. "You don't even know me." "That's the point," he replied. "I don't want a relationship. I don't want drama. I want someone with nothing to lose and something to gain." She flinched at his bluntness, but it was hard to argue with truth when it stared you in the face. "Why not adopt?" she asked. Why not find some rich woman to parade around with? He leaned in slightly, his tone more serious now. Because I want a child who is mine, my blood, my legacy, and because people like me don't trust easily. This way, it's simple, controlled. Ember shook her head. You talk about a baby like it's an investment. To me it is, he said, and I think deep down you understand that kind of survival. She looked away out the window at a world that never cared for her. Her fingers trembled on the coffee cup. There was a part of her that wanted to scream, to throw the drink in his face and walk out into the cold with her pride intact. But pride didn't keep you warm. Pride didn't buy you a future. Pride didn't change the way people looked through you every day, like you were nothing. What happens if I say no? She whispered. Vincent's voice was steady. Then I drop you back where I found you, and you go back to surviving. His words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I need time, she said, to think. You have 24 hours. That night, Ember sat on a park bench beneath the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her breath curled in the cold air. All she had in the world was what she carried in a plastic bag beside her. And yet, for the first time, someone had made her feel like she had something valuable to offer. Even if it was her body, even if it was her womb. But more than that, someone had seen her. What Vincent Hale didn't know was that Ember had already lost everything once. She had once been a daughter, a sister, a student with dreams. Life had taken all of it from her. And now here was a man with a lifeline, one wrapped in thorns and conditions, but a lifeline nonetheless. When the morning came, she stood before his penthouse door, her heart pounding. I accept, she said when he opened it. And with those two words, a deal was struck. A deal that would not only change both their lives, but reveal truths they never dared to face. Because, dear listener, what started as a transaction between two broken souls would soon become something else entirely. Something neither Vincent nor Ember could control. Secrets would be unearthed. Emotions long buried would rise like tides. And when the moment came, when Vincent finally looked into the eyes of the child he had so coldly planned, he would be shattered by what he saw. So stay with me, keep listening, because this story, like life, is not what it seems. The mansion was breathtaking. Grand iron gates opened to reveal a sprawling estate that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. Marble pillars, sweeping staircases, sculpted gardens, and floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the light in a way that made everything sparkle. But for Ember Lee, stepping inside didn't feel like entering a dream. It felt like crossing a line from which there would be no return. She had only a small duffel bag slung over one shoulder, filled with the last reminders of a life she'd barely survived. Vincent's assistant, a composed woman named Natalie, led her inside with a practiced, polite smile and gentle instructions. You'll be staying in the East Wing, she said, her heels clicking softly on the polished floors. It's quiet there, very private. Everything you'll need has already been prepared. Ember nodded silently, her arms wrapped tightly across her chest like a shield. The house was beautiful, yes, but it was also cold, so very cold. The walls were lined with art worth more than she'd ever held in her hands, but none of it made her feel welcome. This wasn't a home, it was a fortress, a place built not to comfort, but to protect someone who had spent too long keeping the world out. When they reached her room, Ember paused. The door was already open, revealing a suite larger than any apartment she'd ever lived in. The bed was king-size, covered in linens so white they looked untouched. A walk-in closet, a bathroom with gold fixtures, and a tub deep enough to drown in. She stepped in slowly, unsure whether to be grateful or afraid. If you need anything, Natalie said, her voice as warm as protocol would allow, just press the button near the nightstand. I'll come. And then she was gone. Ember stood in the center of the room, surrounded by more comfort than she'd known in years, and felt lonelier than ever. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay curled on top of the perfectly made bed, too afraid to disturb the crisp sheets, staring up at the ceiling as shadows danced across it. She hadn't spoken more than a few words to Vincent since arriving. He hadn't even been there to greet her, only sent a quiet nod through Natalie that everything was in place. She told herself it didn't matter. This was a business deal, a transaction. She wasn't here for small talk or candlelit dinners. She was here to carry a child, deliver it, and walk away with her future paid in full. But when the lights were off and the mansion fell into its nighttime hush, her mind wandered. She thought of her childhood, of her little brother Eli, of holding his hand under the kitchen table during their parents' worst fights, of the time she gave up a school trip to buy him shoes, of how he died in the hospital 2 winters ago, pneumonia and no insurance, and how Ember had spent the last of her savings just to bury him with a blanket he loved. She thought of the alleyways and shelters she'd slept in since then, of the men who leered, the women who pitied, the stares, the cold, the hunger that made you question whether you were even still human. And now she was here. She was here, in a mansion, with warm food, silk pajamas, and a bathroom that smelled like lavender instead of bleach. And yet, she couldn't remember the last time she felt this unseen. The days that followed blurred together. Each morning, Natalie would bring her a neatly arranged tray of breakfast, fresh fruit, eggs, toast. But Ember often left most of it untouched. She would wander the mansion in silence, memorizing its stillness. Vincent, true to his nature, stayed distant. He appeared only for brief check-ins, asking curt questions like, "How are the doctors?" or "Are you getting rest?" with the same tone he might use in a shareholder meeting. At first, Ember tried to match that coldness. She spoke only when spoken to, stayed within the rooms allotted to her, and avoided eye contact during their rare encounters. But as her body began to change, so did her resolve. The pregnancy, once a distant concept, slowly became real. At first, it was little things. The fatigue that crept in like fog, the morning nausea, the soreness in her lower back. Then came the heartbeat. At her first appointment, she heard it. That soft, rhythmic flutter, pulsing from the monitor like a tiny drum, insistent and alive. And something in her cracked. She didn't want it to. She had come into this arrangement with full awareness of the boundaries. No attachment, no confusion. But hearing that sound, the sound of something living growing inside her, it was like feeling music after years of silence. A part of her woke up, a part that remembered what it meant to care. Later that night, back at the mansion, Ember stared at her reflection in the mirror, hand resting lightly on her abdomen. "You're not mine," she whispered, as if trying to convince herself. "You're not mine to keep." But her voice shook, and the days that followed only made it worse. The staff, while polite, were always formal. Vincent's instructions were followed to the letter. Ember was to be comfortable, monitored, and left alone. She was given books, tea access, even art supplies after she'd mentioned once that she liked to draw. But none of it filled the space inside her. One afternoon, unable to bear the stillness of the house, Ember wandered outside to the garden. It was vast, manicured, and stunning. The scent of blooming jasmine filled the air. She sat on a bench near the koi pond and watched the fish swim in lazy circles. "I thought I'd find you here," a voice said behind her. She turned to see Vincent, dressed immaculately as always, his hands in his pockets. "I needed fresh air," she replied, avoiding his eyes. He nodded and stood beside her, not sitting. "Are you comfortable? Do you need anything?" Ember shook her head. "Everything's perfect." He looked at her then, his expression unreadable. "But?" She exhaled slowly. "But I feel like a bird in a golden cage." He didn't respond at first, just stood there, watching the koi flick their tails. Then he said something that surprised her. "I built this house so no one could get in. Now I'm wondering if I built it so no one could get out." And just like that, a wall between them cracked. From that day forward, something shifted. Their conversations, still brief, began to carry more weight. Vincent started showing up during meals, even if only for a few minutes. He asked about her artwork. He brought her a set of new pastels one evening, wrapped in soft velvet. When she mentioned her back pain, a massage therapist was arranged for the next morning. Little things, but they mattered. One night, Ember had a nightmare. She was in an alley again, alone, cold, clutching her swollen belly, while strangers passed her by without a glance. She woke up sobbing, unable to breathe. She pressed the call button, and within minutes Natalie was there. But not alone. Vincent came too, eyes wide with concern. "Is it the baby?" he asked, voice tight. "No," she choked out. "It was just a dream." He sat on the edge of the bed, unsure of what to do with his hands. "You're safe here, Ember." And for the first time, she believed him. Weeks passed. Her belly grew. She started sketching again, first in private, then out in the open. Vincent began joining her for morning walks. He asked about her family. She told him about Eli, about the loss that broke her. He didn't speak much in return, but she caught glimpses. Photos in the hallway of a younger Vincent, a brother lost to cancer, parents estranged by greed. Their pain wasn't the same, but it rhymed. One afternoon, while walking past the nursery room that had been quietly prepared, Ember paused. "Do you ever wonder," she said softly, "what kind of person they will become?" Vincent looked at her, his gaze no longer cold. "Every day," he admitted. That night, as she lay in bed, Ember placed her hand on her belly and whispered to the child growing inside her, "I don't know what will happen next, but I hope you'll always feel loved, even if it's from a distance." And yet, even as she said it, her heart ached, because she didn't know if she could walk away. She hadn't expected any of this, not the safety, not the tenderness growing between her and Vincent, not the quiet moments that began to feel like family. She had signed a contract to carry a child, but now she was carrying hope and heartbreak and something dangerously close to love. What she didn't yet know was that Vincent, in his own way, was struggling too. Watching her grow into motherhood, watching her laugh with the staff, watching her change the air in his home, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, alive and afraid. Because sometimes the hardest thing about building walls isn't the act of keeping others out. It's realizing you've locked your own heart in too. Time passed quietly within the marble walls of Vincent Hale's mansion. The weeks after Ember Leah's arrival had been scripted and sterile, like everything Vincent designed in his life. There were schedules for meals, medical checkups arranged with the best obstetricians in the city, regular progress reports filed through his assistant, Natalie. It was the kind of control Vincent craved, a perfectly executed transaction with no room for surprises. But life has a way of seeping through cracks in even the strongest walls. It started small. One evening, Ember was sitting alone in the sunroom, sketchbook balanced on her lap, soft charcoal smudging her fingertips. The rain tapped gently on the tall windows behind her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the quiet felt less like a void and more like a pause. She was sketching this garden, its archways of roses now slick with rain, the koi pond shimmering under gray skies. She didn't hear Vincent's footsteps until he spoke. "You draw well," he said, his voice low and measured. She glanced up, startled. It was the first time he had acknowledged her art. "Thanks," she murmured, unsure how to respond to kindness from a man who'd offered her comfort in exchange for a child, but had never once asked what she loved. He took a step closer, his hands clasped behind his back. "That's the south garden. I had it redone last year." "I could tell," she said with a dry smile. "It looks curated." A small pause. Then to her surprise, Vincent chuckled. "Just a breath, really." "Everything in this house is curated," he admitted, "including me." She looked at him carefully then, really looked. For all his wealth and sharp suits and intimidating presence, there was something fragile underneath. Like a man who had been hardened by life not because he wanted to be, but because he hadn't been given another choice. He didn't linger that night, but it was the beginning. After that, the space between them began to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, like winter thawing into spring. Vincent began appearing during meals. He sat across the table, reading files but occasionally asking how she was feeling. He brought her books when she said she missed reading. Some were clearly expensive, rare editions, but others were secondhand, worn-in copies that felt oddly personal. One morning, a box of art supplies arrived outside her door with a note. "Thought you might need more paper." It wasn't signed, but she knew who had sent it. And then came the late nights. She would find him in the library sometimes, standing by the fire with a glass of scotch in hand, his eyes fixed on the flames like they held all the answers he didn't have. He never invited her in, but she began to linger at the door, sometimes offering a soft good night, sometimes just watching him from the shadows. On the rare occasions when he acknowledged her, it was with a nod or a question like, "Are the babies moving much today?" As if her body, no, their unborn children, had become the only safe bridge between them. But one night changed everything. It was late. The storm outside was furious, wind screaming against the glass like something desperate trying to get in. Ember couldn't sleep. Her back ached, her thoughts wouldn't quiet, and the pounding of the rain only made the mansion feel more like a lonely cathedral. She walked to the library, expecting to find Vincent gone, but there he was, sitting in the armchair closest to the fire, a photograph in his hands. She paused in the doorway. Can't sleep either? He looked up. His eyes were tired, vulnerable. No, she stepped in cautiously. Is that family? He hesitated before turning the photo slightly in her direction. It was old, worn at the edges. A boy with bright eyes. A man with a gentler version of Vincent's face. A woman holding them both, her smile radiant. My brother, my parents, he said, before everything fell apart. Ember said nothing. The fire cracked in the silence. I wasn't always like this, he continued, voice quieter now. I used to laugh, I used to believe in people. But the more you lose, the more walls you build. Until one day you realize you have walled yourself in. She walked to the chair opposite his and sat down. I know what that's like. He looked at her, really looked, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or a shared grief they didn't have to name. Why did you say yes? He asked after a moment. To this, to me. Ember stared into the fire. Because I didn't have a choice. Not really. I've lived too long in the dark. And you offered a door, even if it came with a lock. Vincent looked down at the photo again. I never expected this to feel anything like connection. But with you, it's like I'm learning how to be human again. The days after that night flowed differently. Vincent didn't just appear, he stayed. He asked about the baby's kicks. He sat beside her during her doctor visits. And one evening, when they listened to the heartbeat together, two steady rhythms pulsing from the monitor, he didn't hide his tears. They sound strong, he said, brushing a hand down his face quickly, almost embarrassed. They are, Ember replied. They have to be. There was a time when Vincent would have kept his distance, when emotion would have been a weakness he couldn't afford. But now, sitting beside a woman he once saw as a solution, he felt something that terrified him more than failure ever had. Hope. And Ember, for her part, began to unravel too. She found herself telling him things. About Eli, about the shelters, about the dreams she used to have before her world fell apart. She told him about her sketchbook that got stolen on a bus once, and how she cried harder for that than for any lost belongings. She even told him about her mother's lullaby, the one she hadn't heard since she was 7. Vincent listened, and more than that, he remembered. One night, a package appeared in her room. A framed print of a sketch she had described to him in passing. A field of tall sunflowers under a sweeping sky. And next to it, a small music box. When she opened it, a lullaby played. Soft, familiar. She broke down crying. And the next morning, Vincent didn't ask why. He simply brought her tea. As the weeks passed, Ember and Vincent began walking together in the garden. Sometimes in silence, sometimes trading stories. One afternoon, while watching the koi swim lazily in their pond, Vincent asked something unexpected. Have you thought about names? She blinked. Names? For the babies. She hesitated. I didn't think you'd want me involved in that. He looked at her with surprising softness. You're already involved, whether we like it or not. This isn't just a contract anymore. She didn't respond right away. But later that evening, she wrote 2 names in her sketchbook, Elias and Lyora. For light, she whispered. Vincent found the note the next morning, tucked under his coffee mug. He said nothing, but that day he asked Natalie to begin the nursery in soft yellows and sky blues. The morning air was crisp, sun spilling softly through the tall glass windows of the mansion as Ember Lee sat at the breakfast table, her hand cupped protectively over her growing belly. It had been 3 months since the contract was signed, 3 months since she traded the silence of the streets for the silence of marble halls and manicured gardens. Yet even now, there were days she couldn't believe she lived in this place, where breakfast was delivered under silver cloches and her body was treated like something precious, fragile, revered. She had felt it that morning, a strange pull in her stomach, a nervous flutter like wings under her skin. The kind of feeling you get before something changes. Something is different today, she thought as she ran her fingers over the soft curve beneath her sweater. Vincent Hale entered the room without a word, holding a leather folder of documents like always. But today his stride was slower. His eyes lingered on her a little longer. "You ready?" he asked. Ember nodded. Today was their second official ultrasound. He had surprised her by attending the first. She had expected his assistant Natalie to handle it, but instead, Vincent had stood beside her in that cool, sterile room, his arms crossed, silent and unreadable, until the baby's heartbeat filled the air like a drum roll in a cathedral. That sound had changed something in both of them. Now they were driving together again. Vincent at the wheel, Ember beside him, the city slipping by in muted grays and blues. The silence was heavier than usual. Not awkward, but weighty, charged with anticipation neither dared name. At the clinic, the technician greeted them kindly, chatting lightly as she dimmed the lights and prepped the machine. Ember lay back on the table, her breath catching as the cold gel touched her skin. Vincent stood beside her, his hand resting on the back of the chair, his posture tense. "All right," the technician smiled, guiding the wand over Ember's belly. "Let's see what we've got here." The screen lit up. Shadows and shapes swirled into view. Ember squinted, searching for the familiar, grainy outline of the tiny life growing inside her veil. Vincent's eyes were fixed on the screen, sharp, unblinking. Then the technician tilted her head and paused. "Well now, looks like we've got a surprise today." Ember's heart lurched. She looked up alarmed. "What do you mean?" The technician turned the screen slightly toward them and smiled. "You're not carrying one baby, Miss Lee. You're carrying two. Twins." Silence. Not a breath, not a word. Just that buzzing stillness that only ever comes when a truth too big to process drops into the room like a stone in still water. Ember blinked, tears springing to her eyes before she could even process them. "Twins?" she whispered, voice cracking. Vincent didn't move. He just stared, eyes wide, jaw tight. The technician continued talking, something about positioning and heartbeats and growth charts. But Ember barely heard her. All she could hear was the echo in her mind. Two babies, two lives. A strange mix of joy and terror welled up inside her, rising so fast it nearly choked her. She hadn't planned for one baby, let alone two. Her world had been about survival, not creation. And now, inside her, were two small souls, two futures she would bring into the world. She looked up at Vincent. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were glassy. "Two," he said finally softly, like he was speaking to the universe, not to her. "I didn't expect that." The drive back was quiet, but not the usual quiet. This time, the silence felt alive, full of breath and questions and shifting tides. Halfway home, Ember turned to him. "Are you okay?" Vincent gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "It's just a lot." She nodded, understanding completely. "Yeah." They didn't speak again until they reached the mansion. When they stepped through the front doors, Ember paused in the foyer, hand on the rail, unsure whether to go to her room or stay near him. "Come with me," Vincent said quietly. He led her to the garden where the trees were beginning to change color, leaves drifting gently to the stone path like slow-falling memories. They sat on a bench beside the koi pond. He stared at the water, then finally said, "I planned for everything. I accounted for every scenario except this." Ember looked down at her hands. "I didn't plan for any of it." And there it was, two people, two broken histories, two beating hearts caught in a moment of impossible change. Vincent ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "Two children. It's not just an heir anymore. It's a family." That word caught in Ember's chest like a splinter. Family. She hadn't had one since Eli died, since the last of her threadbare connections to the world vanished. And now, within her, life was blooming, not just for her, but for him. And she knew with a certainty that shook her, that walking away would no longer be simple. She wanted to protect them. She wanted to stay. But she didn't know if she was allowed to want that. "Do you think we can do this?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Vincent looked at her. "I don't know, but I think we have to trauma." That night, Ember couldn't sleep. She sat by the window watching the wind play with the garden leaves, her hand resting on her stomach. She whispered softly, "Two of you. I'll do my best. I promise." Meanwhile, across the house, Vincent stood in the nursery. He hadn't turned the light on. He didn't need to. The moonlight was enough. He looked at the crib he had ordered weeks ago, just one, and realized how wrong he had been to think he could plan love. Twins, two lives, two reasons to be more than the man he had been. He hadn't held them yet, hadn't even seen their faces, but he already knew he would never be the same. In the days that followed, things changed. Vincent became more present, less like a businessman and more like a man. He sat with Ember during meals. He asked how she was sleeping. When she complained of aching feet, he ordered softer shoes. When she said she missed walking in the city, he had the East Garden paved with a path just for her. One morning, Ember found a package waiting on her nightstand. Inside were two tiny onesies, neutral in color, soft to the touch, and a handwritten card that simply said, "They already have your strength." She wept quietly into her pillow. Vincent didn't say anything about the gift when he saw her. He just handed her a warm cup of tea and sat beside her as she watched the garden. It was still a transaction on paper, but not in their hearts, because something had begun to grow between them. Not just the children, but something far more dangerous. Trust, and maybe even love. One evening as the sun bled into the horizon, Ember and Vincent stood at the nursery door together. "We'll need another crib," he said. Ember smiled. "And double the diapers." He chuckled, the sound more natural than she'd ever heard from him. "I thought I was in control," he said, voice soft. "But they're teaching me otherwise." She looked at him, hand on her belly. Maybe that's the point. As the days stretched forward and the twins grew stronger, so did the bond between the man who had everything and the woman who had nothing until now. Because now she had a purpose. Now she had a place. And maybe, just maybe, she had someone who would fight to keep her in it. There's something strange about comfort when you've gone without it for too long. It doesn't feel real at first. It feels like a trick, like the universe dangling softness in front of you just to rip it away when you reach out. That's how Ember Leaf at all I felt. Even as the sheets beneath her body were Egyptian cotton, even as the scent of vanilla and cedarwood lingered in the air, like peace she couldn't believe she deserved. The mansion had grown quieter lately, not in sound, but in weight. The coldness that once clung to the walls like ivy was beginning to peel away, slowly, like old paint giving in to sunlight. Vincent Hale, once nothing more than a shadow in a designer suit, had begun to linger. He no longer barked orders through Natalie or kept his gaze fixed only on contracts and calendar dates. Now he knocked gently on her door before stepping in. He asked how she was feeling, and when she said she was fine, too quickly, too habitually, he didn't just nod and walk away. He paused, he waited. Sometimes he even sat down. It started with the small things. One afternoon, Ember was curled up on the oversized couch in the sunroom, a light blanket wrapped around her legs, sketchbook resting on her belly. She was drawing the nursery, only from memory, from feeling. The cribs, side by side, the pale wallpaper, the mobile she had asked to hang herself, just to feel useful. She didn't hear him enter the room. "That's new," Vincent said quietly, his voice lower than usual, as though he didn't want to disturb the hush. Ember glanced up, surprised. "I was just remembering." He walked over slowly, eyes scanning the soft pencil strokes on the page. "You captured it perfectly." There was something in his voice, something unsure. It wasn't praise given like a bossahana to an employee. It was real, sincere. Ember felt her throat tighten. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. He didn't leave. He sat down in the armchair across from her and after a moment asked, "What did you used to draw before this?" She blinked. "You mean before the pregnancy?" "Yes." Ember stared at the sketchbook, fingers absently running over the spine. "Portraits, people, not the ones in magazines, but people I met in shelters. Strangers who sat across from me on park benches. I liked trying to find the story in their faces." Vincent tilted his head. "You see stories in people?" She gave a sad smile. "It's easier than seeing them in myself." He didn't speak for a long time after that. The next day, Ember returned from her prenatal appointment to find a gift on her bed, a new set of professional drawing pencils, High-end ones she had only seen in art supply stores she never dared enter. No note, no announcement. But she knew. When she walked into the library that evening, he was already there, standing by the fire, hands in his pockets. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't look up right away, but when he did, his expression was different, less guarded. "I didn't know what to get," he admitted, "but I remembered how you talked about sketching faces." She nodded. It was perfect. Gestures like that began happening more often. At first, they felt like anomalies, accidents. A new book left on her bedside table. Her favorite tea, somehow always stocked. A blanket with a floral pattern she'd mentioned missing once in passing. But then, he began showing up, not just physically, but emotionally. One night, Ember woke up disoriented, her heart racing from a dream she couldn't remember. She stood by the window, hugging herself tightly, whispering to the life growing inside her. "It's okay. You're safe." She didn't hear the footsteps until they were near. Vincent's voice was almost a whisper. "Are you all right?" She turned, startled. He was standing in the doorway, shirt slightly rumpled, eyes heavy with sleep. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to wake anyone." "You didn't." He hesitated, then added, "I couldn't sleep either." They stood in silence for a while, the city lights glittering beyond the glass. "It's strange," she said, voice low, "how quiet it is here. The world outside always feels like it's pressing in, loud and demanding. But here, it's just me. And them." She touched her belly gently. Vincent moved a little closer. "It used to feel like a fortress. Now it just feels big." She looked at him, and for the first time she saw something that didn't quite fit into the image she had painted of him in her mind. Loneliness. "I used to hate silence," she said. "It reminded me of being forgotten." He looked down. "I built my whole life around silence. I thought it made me strong." Ember studied him, this man who once treated her like a vessel and now stood beside her like a partner. Or something like it. Maybe we were both wrong. Dear listener, if you've ever felt like silence was safer than speaking, like walls were better than windows, leave a comment below. Type, "I see you, Ember." Reminder that she's not invisible anymore. That being seen, being loved, is something she's earned, even if the world once told her otherwise. It was around that time that something shifted. One morning, as Vincent passed her in the hallway, he asked if she wanted to join him for coffee in the study. Just coffee, just two people sitting in the same room without a reason beyond company. She said yes, and it became a habit. Some mornings they spoke, some mornings they didn't, but each day they met there. At first it was small talk, the weather, headlines, the baby names she was thinking of. He told her about a puppy he once had as a child, a golden retriever named Max. She laughed. "I can't picture you with this too." He smiled. He was the only one who could get me to stop working. "I like Max already," she said. Later that week, Ember was surprised to find a stuffed golden retriever waiting in the nursery crib, a small note tied to its collar. "Max 2.0, start training early." She held it against her chest for a long time. Their connection deepened slowly, like roots winding together beneath the surface. Vincent began walking with her in the garden, not out of obligation, but because he seemed to want to. He started asking how she slept, how her back was doing, whether she needed anything to help her rest. He even joined her during yoga sessions Natalie had arranged, fumbling his way through poses with a mix of grace and sheer stubbornness. One night, during one of their long walks beneath the stars, Ember asked, "Why did you pick me?" He paused, his gaze fixed on the moonlight, reflecting off the koi pond. "Because you didn't look at me the way everyone else did. You weren't impressed. You weren't afraid. You just looked." Ember's throat tightened. "I didn't think I'd ever be seen again." He met her gaze. "You're not invisible to me." As the third trimester approached, Vincent became more involved. He was at every appointment. He began researching twin development late into the night. He joined Natalie in organizing the nursery, arguing over crib placement and wall colors like a man who was no longer pretending not to care. In Ember, she felt something she never thought she'd feel in a place like this. Safe. But that safety came with fear too, because she knew the agreement, she knew the terms. And no matter how kind Vincent was now, no matter how many cups of tea or tender glances passed between them, the truth remained. This wasn't supposed to be love. But how do you stop love when it grows in silence, in shared coffee, in bedtime talks at nursery doors? How do you unfeel the comfort of another soul becoming familiar? One night, unable to bear the weight of it all, Ember spoke. I'm scared, she confessed, sitting by the fireplace as Vincent stared into the flames. He looked at her, eyebrows drawn. I'm scared that when they're born, you'll go back to who you were before. He didn't answer right away, but then he said, I'm scared of that too. She blinked, surprised. I spent so long shutting everything out. I didn't believe in connection. I didn't think I deserved it. But then you came and now I don't know how to go back. He reached across the space between them and placed his hand gently over hers. You've changed me, Ember. Her heart broke open at that, because she had changed too. And not because someone saved her, but because she finally felt safe enough to save herself. The morning began like any other, with light slipping gently across the stone floors of the mansion and Ember Lee sitting quietly at the window, a steaming cup of herbal tea cupped in her hands. She was in her final weeks now, the baby shifting restlessly beneath her skin like the sea before a storm. The past months had reshaped her life, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and she carried all of it with a grace that had only deepened in the quiet of this strange, beautiful, and utterly unexpected home. Vincent Hale had changed too. He had gone from distant observer to present companion, from cold contract holder to something Ember couldn't quite name. Protector, maybe. Confidant. A presence she had learned to lean on when the night stretched too long. They still didn't speak of the future. Not out loud, but their silences had softened. There were no more masks between them. Just a shared space suspended between what had been and what was about to come. That morning, Ember smiled as one of the babies kicked, hard and sure, just beneath her ribs. She murmured something soft, something motherly, something private as she gently stroked her belly. But then, a shift. Not the usual discomfort or sharp little foot against her side. This was different, lower, deeper, and it didn't fade. A few minutes later, it came again, stronger. She gripped the armrest of her chair, the teacup trembling slightly in her other hand. Her breath hitched. Okay, she whispered, placing the cup down. Okay. She called for Natalie, her voice steadier than she felt, and within minutes, the rhythm of the house changed. Natalie's professional calm was quickly replaced by urgent efficiency. She helped Ember lie down, began timing the contractions, then quietly excused herself to find Vincent. When he arrived, tie undone, jacket forgotten, worry etched across his face, Ember had already begun to sweat. Her hands clutched the sheets, jaw tight. Ember, he said, kneeling beside the bed. Is it time? She nodded. They're coming. And just like that, the world tilted. Vincent barked into his phone, ordering the car, the staff, the doctor, the bags. But even in his urgency, he never left her side for more than a breath. When the driver arrived, Vincent lifted Ember carefully into the back seat, cradling her like something sacred. On the way to the hospital, she tried to focus on her breathing, but fear gripped her chest. Her body was trembling. The pain was sharp, rhythmic, and rising. Vincent took her hand. Look at me, he said, voice firm but soft. You're doing great. You're strong. She met his eyes, and something in his gaze steadied her. She nodded, breathing through another wave of pain. When they arrived at the hospital, the nurses moved quickly, wheeling Ember into the delivery room while Vincent signed forms with shaking hands. Despite the staff's insistence that he wait outside, he refused. I'm staying with her, he said, his voice unyielding. I'm not leaving. And he didn't. Hours passed in a blur of contraction and effort, soft cries and bright lights, nurses rushing in and out. Vincent held Ember's hand the entire time, wiping her brow, whispering words she couldn't always hear but always felt. I'm here. You've got this. I won't let go. Her cries grew louder, the pain near unbearable, but Vincent never faltered. In that room, stripped of luxury and business, stripped of every cold defense, he became something Ember had never seen before. Human, raw, tender. And when the final push came and the cry of a newborn pierced the air, it wasn't just Ember who wept. The doctor held up the baby, wrapped in a soft blue blanket. It's a boy, he said, smiling. The tiny infant let out another wail, and Ember's arms reached instinctively. But before she could fully embrace the moment, another pain rolled through her, fierce and fast. "There's more," she gasped. And then the second baby arrived, smaller but just as fierce, her cry high and wild. "It's a girl." The nurse laid the babies on Ember's chest, and for a moment, the world stopped. She looked at their faces, so tiny, so real, and something inside her cracked wide open. She had carried them in silence through storms and solitude, and now they were here, whole, alive, hers. Vincent stood at the foot of the bed, utterly still. He had never seen anything like this. He had faced hostile takeovers, lawsuits, and corporate war zones without flinching. But this made his knees weak. His chest ached with something unfamiliar and overwhelming. He moved closer, hands trembling, and the nurse placed the boy in his arms. Vincent stared down at the tiny face, the round cheeks, the soft tufts of dark hair, the impossibly small fingers curling instinctively around his thumb. He didn't speak. He just stared. And then his shoulders shook. Tears slipped silently down his cheeks, not from fear, but from a kind of love that had no language. He looked at Ember. "You did this," he whispered, voice breaking. "You gave them life." "No," she replied, exhausted but smiling. "We did." Dear listener, if your eyes are misty right now, if your heart is wrapped in the moment Vincent cradled his child for the first time, please leave a comment below. Type, "Welcome to the world," for these tiny souls. Let them arrive in a world that sees them, loves them, and celebrates this miracle. Hours passed. Ember rested in her hospital bed, the baby sleeping beside her in clear cradles. Vincent hadn't left. He stood near the window, staring at the skyline, watching the night slowly fold itself into morning. "You can sit," Ember said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned, almost surprised she was awake. "I don't want to miss anything," he replied. She nodded. "I don't think I've ever felt this tired, or this full." Vincent came to her side and took her hand again. "They're perfect," he said, and then slowly, carefully he added, "You're perfect." Tears welled in Ember's eyes, not from pain this time, but from something else. Relief, validation, the beginnings of a love that had nothing to do with contracts. Later, as the first hints of dawn slipped through the hospital windows, Vincent leaned over the bassinets, his fingers brushing gently against the baby's tiny chests. He didn't say a word, but his eyes said everything. Ember watched him, her heart pounding. "You look like a father," she said. He turned to her, eyes glassy again. "I am a father." He stepped toward her, and with the gentlest touch, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "And you're their mother," he said, "not just the woman who carried them, not just a clause in a contract." Ember's lips trembled. "But I was never supposed to be anything more." He knelt beside her, took her hand, and looked at her with more truth than she had ever seen in any man's face. "Neither was I." That morning before they left the hospital, Vincent stood beside the nurses as they filled out the birth certificates. "Names?" one of them asked. Ember looked up at him, waiting. Vincent smiled and said, "Elias, for the boy, and Leora, for the girl." Ember's eyes filled with tears. Those were the names she had once whispered to the stars. And now they were written, alive, real. The past would never disappear. The pain, the brokenness, the years of loneliness, they would always be part of the story. But now, so would this moment. 2 children, 2 hearts, and one love they never saw coming. The mansion was silent. It was the kind of silence that filled not just the hallways, but the spaces between breaths, between thoughts. The kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from goodbye, hovering like mist in the corners of the room. Ember Lee stood in her room, staring down at the small, worn suitcase on the bed. It was almost comical in size. One small bag to hold everything she had become, everything she had endured, everything she was now preparing to leave behind. The twins were asleep in the nursery. Vincent Hale had not spoken much since they returned from the hospital. He had been attentive, gentle even, but quieter, like a man staring at a clock, knowing it was counting down something he was too afraid to stop. This morning, Ember knew what the day meant. The contract had been clear. She had signed it with trembling hands and a steady voice. Back when she thought survival was the only thing she deserved. Back when love was a myth and trust was a risk she couldn't afford. And though everything had changed, though he had changed, the contract still remained. A reminder, a deadline. Today was the day she was supposed to walk away. She folded the baby blanket with trembling hands, her fingers lingering on the soft fabric. It still smelled like them, like milk and lavender and the faint, innocent scent of new life. She pressed it to her chest. Tears welled, but she blinked them away. She couldn't cry. Not now. Not yet. When she descended the stairs, suitcase in hand, Natalie was waiting by the door. Even the assistant, always poised, always unreadable, seemed heavy with unspoken sorrow. "Are you sure?" Natalie asked quietly. Ember nodded, though her knees were weak. "It's what we agreed." Natalie hesitated, then softer. "He hasn't said a word all morning." "I know," Ember said. "Neither have I." Just then, a sound from behind, a breath, a shift of footsteps. She turned. Vincent stood at the end of the hallway, frozen. His eyes landed on her, and for a moment neither moved. She felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind in her hair, waiting to see whether she would fly or fall. He walked forward slowly, like each step took effort. Not because he was unsure, but because this moment mattered more than any deal, any boardroom, any empire he'd ever built. He stopped just in front of her. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rough. "So that's it?" She swallowed hard. That was the deal. He looked at the suitcase, then at her. "Do you really want to leave?" Ember faltered. "I don't know what I want. I just know what I promised." And then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the contract. That brittle, pristine sheet of paper, the one that had dictated everything. The one that had kept feelings in check, futures in boxes. He held it up, and then, slowly, deliberately, he tore it in half, and again, until the pieces fluttered to the floor like snow. Ember gasped, staring at him. "What are you doing?" she whispered. Vincent looked at her, eyes full of something raw, unguarded. "I'm ending it. The contract, the control, all of it." Her voice trembled. "You can't just tear up a contract and expect that to change everything." "I know," he said, "but I had to start somewhere." He stepped closer, hands open, heart exposed. "I didn't think I could love. I didn't think I was capable. I built my life around numbers and rules and guarantees. And then you came into it. And suddenly, none of that made sense anymore." She shook her head, trying to stay grounded, but her heart was pounding. "You say that now, but what happens when it gets hard? When the babies cry all night? When I fall apart?" Vincent took her hands gently in his. "Then I'll stay. I'll fight. I'll hold you together if you break. Because that's what love is, Ember. It's not clean, it's not contractual. It's waking up every day and choosing someone. And I choose you." Her breath caught. He leaned forward, forehead resting against hers. "I choose you, not as a carrier, not as a part of the plan, but as the woman who gave me everything I never had the courage to want." She wanted to believe him. Oh, how she wanted to, but old wounds don't close with words. "I've been left before," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been discarded, forgotten. I can't survive that again." Vincent pulled back slightly, meeting her eyes. His gaze held no arrogance, no bravado, only truth. "Then let me be the man who never leaves." She stared at him, and something cracked open inside her. The years of loneliness, of hunger and fear, of nights spent on sidewalks praying for the cold to pass, it all swelled to the surface. And standing before her was a man who had once treated her like a transaction, now begging to be her home. Dear listener, if you're here in this moment, if you've walked every mile of this journey with Ember, if you felt the way she held her heart in trembling hands, unsure whether to give it or guard it, please comment below. Type, "Stay, Ember," to let her know that healing is not just possible, it is deserved. That love, real love, is worth the risk. She dropped the suitcase, not dramatically, just quietly, like someone who had finally stopped running. "I'm scared," she said again. He nodded. "So am I." They stood there in silence, wrapped in something that wasn't a promise, but something even stronger. A beginning. Later that day, she walked into the nursery, the soft glow of sunlight spilling over the cribs. The twins stirred, their little fists twitching in sleep. Vincent stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder. "This room feels different now," he said. She smiled softly. "Because it's not just a nursery, it's a family." That night, after the babies were tucked in and the mansion had grown quiet, Ember stood on the terrace, looking out at the sky. Vincent came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Do you regret staying?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, I just wonder why I ever thought I didn't belong." He kissed the top of her head. "You've always belonged." And somewhere in the distance, a soft wind carried away the last remnants of who they used to be. What remained was was real. What remained was love. There was a stillness in the air that morning, one that seemed to settle not just around the mansion, but inside Ember Lee's chest. The storm of uncertainty that had once ruled her life had quieted. No longer was she drifting, waiting for another door to close. Now she stood barefoot in the nursery doorway, watching the early sunlight spill across two sleeping babies, Elias and Leora, and realized, for the first time in years, she felt like she was home. The decision to stay hadn't come easily. It wasn't some fairy tale climax with music swirling and kisses in the rain. It was quieter than that, realer than that. It had come in pieces, moments built like stones stacked by steady hands. Vincent's voice when he said, "You're not invisible to me." The way he stood next to her during late-night feedings, nervous and awkward, but present. The way he held her hand in silence, not knowing what to say but choosing to stay. Staying meant risk, but leaving meant regret, and Ember had lived too long with regret. So when he whispered, "Let's build something together," not from a contract, not out of fear, but from love, she didn't run. She just nodded, tears in her eyes, and said, "Okay." The days that followed felt different, sacred in a way. There was no grand announcement, no parade of change, but the mansion, once pristine and perfect like a photograph, began to feel lived in, laughed in, loved in. Bottles appeared in the kitchen. Soft lullabies drifted down the hall. Ember's drawings were no longer tucked away in sketchbooks. They were framed, hung beside the stairwell, placed near the cribs. Her presence was no longer an agreement. It was a choice, a place. Vincent became a father in the small, clumsy ways that mattered most. He rocked the babies at 2 a.m., even when he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He fumbled with tiny diapers and ducked at the unexpected fountains of newborn boys. He read parenting books with a highlighter, sent Natalie out for the softest burp cloths, and learned how to swaddle by watching Ember's hands with reverence. She caught him singing, badly, to Leora once in the hallway, a lullaby off-key but full of heart. And in return, Ember softened too. She no longer apologized for her presence, no longer braced for judgment. She laughed freely, filled the kitchen with stories, and told Vincent about her dreams without lowering her voice. She painted the nursery wall with a sky and stars because she wanted their children to grow up knowing there was always something bigger guiding them. One night after a particularly chaotic dinner of burp cloths and mashed sweet potatoes, Vincent surprised her. He took her hand across the table, cleared his throat in that way he did when he was nervous, and said, "I want to marry you." Ember blinked, stunned. Not because she hadn't thought of it, but because hearing it felt like a door creaking open into the life she had always believed was locked to her. You want to?" she asked, voice small. "Not because of obligation," he said. "Not because it's the next step, but because I love you. And I want our children to grow up in a home that was chosen, not by lawyers, but by hearts." And right there in that kitchen, filled with baby bottles, half-wiped counters, and the scent of leftover soup, Ember smiled. A wide, tearful smile. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's build that home." The wedding wasn't extravagant. It was held in the garden, beneath the same archway where Ember used to sit sketching in silence, back when she didn't yet believe she belonged. The garden had bloomed since then, just as she had. White roses lined the path. Soft music drifted through the air. Natalie cried when she handed Ember a bouquet of wildflowers, hand-picked, imperfect, and beautiful. Ember wore a simple ivory dress, barefoot, hair down, a crown of baby's breath delicately resting in her curls. Vincent waited at the altar in a tailored suit, his hands shaking slightly. The twins, nestled in matching bassinets nearby, cooed and gurgled in the sunlight as if blessing the day in their own language. There were no crowds, just the people who had walked the journey with them. Natalie, the pediatrician who had cried at their birth, the driver who had driven Ember to her first appointment, the nanny who hummed lullabies like second nature. But what made the ceremony unforgettable was the vows. Vincent stood before Ember, took her hands in his and said, "I built walls around my heart for most of my life, not because I didn't want love, but because I didn't believe I could survive it. You broke those walls, not with force, but with presence. You showed me that love isn't neat, it's messy. It cries at midnight, it throws up on your shirt, it forgives, and it stays. I vow to stay, to learn, to listen, to choose you every single day." Ember couldn't stop crying. When it was her turn, her voice shook, but she spoke with strength. "I never thought I'd be seen. I never thought I'd be more than a burden to carry. But you gave me a home, not made of marble, but of quiet mornings, tiny hands, and second chances. You held me when I didn't know how to be held. And today, I choose you. Not because you saved me, but because you walked with me. I vow to do the same." When they kissed, it wasn't dramatic. It was soft, sacred. The kind of kiss that says, "We've been through the fire, and we're still there." The weeks after the wedding were not perfect, but they were theirs. There were long nights, sleepless feedings, teething fits, days when Ember wondered if she was failing, and nights when Vincent paced the nursery floor, whispering calming nonsense to Elias and Leora. But through it all, they were a team. They cooked together, while mostly Ember cooked while Vincent learned not to burn toast. They danced in the kitchen with the babies strapped to their chests. They read books late into the night, sprawled on the couch like any ordinary couple in love. Ember began painting again. Her studio overlooked the garden. And in one corner of her canvas, she painted 3 stars, one for each soul who changed her life: Elias, Leora, and Vincent. One evening, Vincent found her standing quietly at the nursery door, watching the twins sleep. "What are you thinking, Mom?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her. She leaned into him. "I'm thinking, I was never supposed to have this, and yet, here I am." He kissed her temple. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." And for once, she believed him. Not because she needed to, but because it felt true. Because love isn't about what we're promised. It's about what we choose. And Ember had finally chosen herself, her children, her home, her love. The sun rose slowly over the Hale estate, brushing golden light across the dew-drenched garden, where white roses nodded in the breeze. Birds chirped softly in the trees, their melodies wrapping around the house like a lullaby for a home that had finally learned how to breathe. Inside, the nursery was alive with soft motion. 2 babies cooing in their cribs, tiny arms reaching, eyes blinking in sleepy wonder at a world just beginning. Ember Lee stood by the window, her arms wrapped loosely around herself, watching her children wake. And behind her, Vincent Hale approached, barefoot, a bottle in one hand and a blanket in the other. He moved quietly now, not with the stiff efficiency of a man used to control, but with the learned grace of a father who had surrendered to the gentle rhythm of sleepless nights, whispered lullabies, and the unmatched joy of small hands wrapped around his finger. The babies stirred, Busherer, Leora with her tiny fists stretched above her head, Elias with a sleepy sigh that melted Vincent's heart every single time. Ember turned and smiled, her hair a little messy, her eyes tired but glowing. "Did they sleep?" she asked softly. Vincent chuckled, placing the bottle down on the dresser. "Like warriors, 2 hours at a time." She laughed, stepping into his arms. "That's practically a miracle." And they stood there for a moment, wrapped in silence, in the scent of warm milk and baby powder. This was their life now, not polished, not perfect, but real. And in that reality, there was a depth neither of them had known before. A purpose that stretched beyond their scars, their past mistakes, and the contract that had once defined their beginning. Because this was no longer about deals or expectations. This was family. Later that morning, they sat on the back porch with coffee cups in hand, the babies napping inside and the gentle sound of wind rustling the trees all around them. Ember wore one of Vincent's old shirts. Vincent hadn't shaved in days, and yet both looked more whole than they ever had in their lives. I used to think success was about money, Vincent said, staring out across the lawn. About legacy, buildings with my name on them, influence, control. He looked at Ember, his expression soft. But it's this quiet moment, these tiny socks in the laundry, these sleepless nights and giggles from the hallway. That's what I'll remember when I'm old. Not a company, not a merger. This. Ember blinked back tears. I used to think survival meant shutting down, she said, her voice low. That if I had just kept going, stayed invisible, never asked for more, I wouldn't get hurt again. But I was wrong. She reached across the table and took his hand. Love isn't the absence of pain. It's what gives the pain purpose. Vincent nodded. You gave my life meaning, Ember, not by saving me, but by letting me save myself, next to you. They sat there for a long time, sipping coffee and watching the day unfold. Their life wasn't easy. The twins cried, a lot. Diapers ran out, bottles spilled. Ember doubted herself. Vincent got frustrated. The mansion, once pristine and spotless, now bore the joyful chaos of a growing family. Tiny shoes by the door, pacifiers under couches, toys on mahogany floors. But for every hard moment, there were 10 small miracles. The way Elias smiled first thing in the morning. The way Leora clutched Ember's necklace when she nursed. The way Vincent stared at them like he still couldn't believe they were real. There was laughter, so much laughter. In the middle of the night, while rocking the twins. At breakfast, when Vincent misread the baby food instructions and turned sweet potato into something that exploded in the blender. In the garden where Ember twirled barefoot with Laura against her chest while Vincent clapped along like a proud fool. They weren't just surviving, they were living. And through each other, they found something far more powerful than safety. They found healing. Ember began drawing again, not just sketches, but full paintings. She painted the twins, asleep in each other's arms. She painted Vincent, holding them in the sunlight. And eventually, she painted herself. Not the version who lived in the shadows, but the woman who had come through fire and found her light again. Vincent, once chained to board meetings and blueprints, discovered something new. He started spending his mornings with the twins before work, reading them poetry in a low, soothing voice. He held Ember's hand during pediatrician visits. He began mentoring young business leaders with different values, with heart. And sometimes, late at night, they sat together on the floor of the nursery, watching their children breathe and talked about the past. The pain, the cold, the nights they thought they wouldn't survive. They didn't run from it, because now they had something stronger than fear. They had each other. Dear listener, if you've followed this journey from the sidewalk to the altar, from the silence of survival to the laughter of a home reborn, then you know this isn't just a love story, it's a life story. And if Ember's strength touched your heart, if Vincent's transformation gave you hope, please type new beginnings in the comments. Let this couple know that their journey mattered, not just to them, but to you. And if there's one lesson this story offers, one truth to carry into your own life, it's this. Love doesn't always arrive the way we expect. Sometimes it knocks on your door, wearing grief wrapped in old coats and burdened with doubt. Sometimes it doesn't look like fireworks or grand declarations. Sometimes it looks like a man learning how to change a diaper at 3 a.m., or a woman believing for the first time that she is not a burden, but a gift. It looks like forgiveness, like second chances, like holding someone close, not because they're perfect, but because they stayed. So if you're out there tonight, listening in the quiet, wondering if your life can still bloom, if you've been discarded, overlooked, underestimated, if you've ever questioned whether you deserve more, let this story be your reminder. You do. You are not broken, you are not too late, and you are never beyond the reach of love. Not the kind that demands perfection, but the kind that sees your scars and stays anyway. Dear friend, if this story meant something to you, if you felt seen, if it brought you comfort, or simply reminded you that hope isn't lost, please like this video. It helps us bring more stories like this to those who need them most. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story, because every week we share real human moments like this one. Stories that remind us that healing is possible, that redemption is real, and that no matter how hard life has been, a new beginning is always within reach. So stay with us because your story isn't over either.